Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for day two of the Opioid Industry Document Archives 2026 Symposium. My name is Beth Whipple, and I'm Interim Director of the Welch Medical Library at Johns Hopkins University. On behalf of the entire OIDA team, we're so glad you're joining us for our third National Symposium. Please note the symposium is being recorded. Links to the recording will be posted on our website and shared to our email list. Before we begin, I want to note that none of today's speakers have reported any conflicts of interest relating to the opioid industry, UCSF, or JHU. The Opioid Industry Documents Archive, or OIDA, is a groundbreaking digital archive of documents arising from the opioid industry that advances understanding of the root causes of the epidemic and helps address corporate behavior that is harmful to public health. Winner of the Society of American Archivists Archival Innovator Award and co-created by the University of California, San Francisco, and Johns Hopkins University, OIDA recently reached a 7 million document milestone, representing more than 33 million pages. The documents include emails, memos, presentations, sales reports, budgets, audit reports, Drug Enforcement Administration briefings, meeting agendas and minutes, expert witness reports, and depositions of company executives. The archive serves as a living repository of information that can be used to learn from the opioid epidemic so as to improve and safeguard public policy and public health, and to ensure that the opioid-related harms that have taken place never occur again. OIDA was created and funded in part through settlements to public interest lawsuits by states, and we would like to acknowledge the millions of Americans who have been personally impacted by the crisis, as well as acknowledge and recognize the attorneys general and many other parties whose vision and commitment to transparency and accountability has made the archive possible. We strive to ensure that OIDA serves as a trusted resource of information to help people understand the U.S. opioid crisis. We are developing this digital archive and its supporting resources for the benefit of the public, including individuals, communities, researchers, journalists, policymakers, and others affected by the crisis. OIDA and its services are freely available to all. I'd also like to thank Kevin Hawkins and Amanda Norman, who are also on this call. They're members of the OIDA team who have worked especially hard to organize this year's symposium, as well as our colleague Kate Tasker at UCSF, and the broader teams at UCSF and Johns Hopkins, the teams that are responsible for the archive's enormous reach and impact since its inception only a few years ago. Finally, I would like to thank all of you and all of our speakers who are participating in this year's events. The OIDA team is creating a number of resources to help with further exploration, teaching, and mining of the archive. For example, in recent years, we introduced an opioid crisis timeline, a curriculum library, the OIDA data toolbox, and the OIDA image collection. These resources, as well as our research guides and recently released curated document sets, provide archive visitors with footholds and tools for research, data analysis, and other forms of exploration and discovery. Indeed, there are many stories to tell from the OIDA documents, from marketing tactics to abatement strategies to policy making, and much more. We expect the archive to support research looking back at the crisis and helping to formulate systemic change to prevent future harms to public health. I now want to introduce Stefana Breitwieser, Collections Archivist for OIDA at JHU, who will introduce today's panelists.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm really thrilled to introduce our three speakers today. Our first speaker is Christopher Prom. Chris is a professor and coordinator of sponsored research development and acting head of the History, Philosophy, and Newspaper Library at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. A fellow of the Society of American Archivists, he holds a PhD in history from the University of Illinois. He is most recently the author of the second edition of Preserving Email, a technical watch report published by the Digital Preservation Coalition. Currently, he serves as director of the DNA Trust Program, an initiative that seeks to organize a decentralized group of people to create and maintain a digital news archive, and a project we'll hear more about today. Our second speaker is Luciana Duranti. She is a professor emerita at the School of Information at the University of British Columbia. Her areas of specialization are archival theory, diplomatics, and digital records. Since 1998, she has been director of Interpares, a multinational and multidisciplinary research project studying the long-term preservation of trustworthy digital records. The latest iteration of the project, I Trust AI, which began in 2021, aims to ensure that archival concepts and principles inform the development of responsible AI. She has previously served as both the president of the Society of American Archivists and the Association of Canadian Archivists. And finally, our third speaker today will be Paco Nathan. He leads the DevRel for Entity Resolved Knowledge Graph Practice Area at Senzing.com and is a computer scientist with 40 plus years of tech industry experience and core expertise in data science, natural language, graph technologies, and cloud computing. He's the author of numerous books, videos, and tutorials about these topics, and also hosts the monthly Graph Power Hour. So I hope everyone will help me welcoming these speakers. Once we hear from all three of them, we will have time for questions and then some discussion. So if you have a question, please enter it in the Zoom Q&A interface, and we hope to cover as many of these as possible. So with all of that, I will turn it over to Chris.
Hey, great. Thank you, Stefana. I am going to share my slides here if you give me just a moment. Okay, great. Thank you again. So thank you for that wonderful welcome, Stefana. I'd like to thank the OIDA staff for the invitation to be here, particularly Kevin and Amanda, and also yesterday's presenters. Unfortunately, I was not able to see their presentations because I was in flight at the time, but I've had a chance to review them, and I always appreciate the opportunity to be the second set of speakers because then you can react to some things that have come first. I'd also like to thank all of you for being here today. When Kevin initially asked me to do this, it was 2 years ago, and I have to admit I was very reluctant. In fact, I had declined twice speaking to this group because I quite frankly wasn't sure what to say to all of you. But now I feel like I have something worthwhile to say, so I'm very glad to be here. My talk this morning, as you can see, my topic here is open, building archives and trust in times of urgency and rapid change. And I'm taking that talk to be about AI partially because I know that's the topic for today, but really as a type of bearing witness to my own interaction with opioids, to what I see as the needs of the urgent times we're living through for building archives and the way that mass archives can address those. So as I said, and then of course the specific ways that the OIDA can do that. As I said, this is a very personal topic to me. This is a photo that I took on October 31st of last year after my daughter was hit at a 45-degree angle by a semi that crossed over on the freeway and within a second had crashed into her Honda Civic. Now, thankfully, she survived that crash, but she had very, very serious injuries, which involved her being on opioids for a period of about 6 to 8 weeks, I believe. And I can tell you it was difficult for me. I cannot share her perspective because I did not experience what she experienced in terms of the pain of the accident and more specifically the pain of tapering from the off the opioids. But I saw firsthand how difficult it is and knew that it took the support of myself, my wife, our work communities, our church communities, our families, people all around her to taper off these drugs, which were extremely powerful in helping her, but also very, very difficult to remove herself from, in spite of her own willpower. Thankfully, she was able to do that. And here's a picture. You can see her in the bottom right-hand corner here before she was able to walk. She's actually doing fine now. She's going to be starting a job next week, and she has a long way to go. But what I found out is that this is a very preventable tragedy that she participated in or was unfortunately involved in. A little bit of research I just did shows that we have over 5,000 deaths by trucks per year in the United States, and that's to say nothing of people like my daughter. And opioids bear a particular burden in that. This op-ed in particular makes the point that just like opioids, the trucking industry operates within a particular regulatory structure. So I've borne witness to that. I've seen the results of it. I won't go into detail about that. But my talk today is really intended to address sort of structure that I think we can use to think about the times we're working through and living through right now. About 10 years or so, I read a book in my faith tradition by a theologian named Walter Brueggemann, and the title of his book is about Old Testament prophets, and they talk about in difficult social, political, economic times, bearing witness by acknowledging reality, grieving for the ways in which reality plays out, and then having hope for the future. So I'd like to structure my talk today. Now, I hardly think of myself as a prophet, but it is true that I think by looking at what the reality is, whether it's in regard to my daughter's accident, regard to the opioid crisis, or other areas, we need to do this, because the fact is that the world we are living through and have been part of, the post-World War II liberal order, is very much threatened. Now, for a lot of people, the typical response to that is to deny what's happening or to ignore it. Let's pretend that what is happening is not in fact happening. Let's live our lives. Let's let tomorrow worry about itself. But Brueggemann says instead we must state simply what the true reality is, so that we do not give in to the lie that says that what is true is not true, that what you see is not what you really see. And that's something that the OIDA does so very well. Now, we're talking about artificial intelligence here, and I'm going to do a little bit of a sidetrack. So this is my background. I grew up in rural Wisconsin. My father was a factory worker. He grew up living in this house just north of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, about 30 miles or so. This is the reality that we see where my father grew up today. One of the world's largest data centers being built specifically to serve Oracle and OpenAI. So when we see artificial intelligence, we need to understand that there's a physical infrastructure behind it. We all know that, but seeing the reality of this firsthand, this is one of only 8 buildings that's being built on that site over presumably a 5-year period of time, a 2,300-acre site given over to AI. So that's part of the reality we're living in. Here are 2 articles from the New York Times about the elimination of USAID, the Iran war timeline. This is part of our reality. The dismantling of those programs, our own country's unprovoked attack on Iran, that is our reality. Here's another about what has been happening in Gaza and in Lebanon in particular, because we have a government that has done things that have always been refused in the past, which is restraining our own allies, in this case, the Israelis. And we also have to acknowledge that we have the reality of continued and, in fact, sort of Jim Crow 2.0 taking place right now. So how do we look at that? What lies behind all of this? Many years ago, I read a book about President Abraham Lincoln, who's my personal favorite president, the great emancipator, obviously held the Union together. Now, once Lincoln was asked to name a man to be a member of his cabinet, and he simply remarked, "I don't like the way he looks," and astounded the person who had asked Lincoln, to recommend this, had recommended this individual to the cabinet, said, but the poor man, how could he be responsible for his face? To which Lincoln replied simply, "Every man over 40 is responsible for his face." And these are the faces of the people who are shaping our world. I will not dwell on them now, but I think there are alternate ways we can look. Now, what lies behind this at a deeper level? We know about income inequality, and we know also about deaths of despair. And that the world we live in is leading people to a moment of despair. Opioids are frankly a very big part of that crisis. We saw some stats yesterday of the number of opioid deaths, and while it's tapering off, it is still far too prominent. And, again, I go back to the faces of those types of people who have put these things forward. Now, what does this mean for archives? I will confess to you, I have very specific fears around the role that libraries and archives are playing at this moment in time. The archival profession, the library profession, has put a lot of resources into digitization. Very good work, excellent work needs to be done. We have not put anywhere near the amount of resources into with the exception of things like the OIDA, the Internet Archive, anywhere near the amount of resources into the preservation of born digital materials about the times we are living in. There are also questions around selection. What are we selecting? Are we really neutral arbiters? Are we preserving email? I can tell you we are not preserving it at the level it needs to be preserved, or new forms of media. Newspapers mostly are in databases that we rent back from private corporations. I would argue forsaking our traditional role as preservers of those and as owners of that content. In terms of openness, there's also an urgency at this particular moment around the academic literature. How much of the academic literature is in fact going to be open? That's a debate for another day. Government records, how much of it is going to be open? We know what's happening with things like PubMed Central, local and national news. Is it being preserved? There's a conference next month speaking about that issue. What is the future of the Internet Archive and Wikipedia? We would like to think they're permanent parts of our infrastructure, but are they really? We've seen the pressure that both IA and Wikipedia are under, whether that's motivated politically or because of legal actions. So all of this reality honestly leads us, or should lead us, to a profound sense of grief, which is the second of Brueggemann's triad. Reality, this is the reality we have. What can people of goodwill do in times? How can we ensure the continuity of an open society based upon democratic values? The fact of the matter is those things should lead us to grieve. And what does it mean to grieve at what is being lost or at risk in such times, personally and professionally? Now, Brueggemann argues that grief has a purpose, but only if we let it allow it to have that purpose. And specifically, it should lead us to a collective sense of lament over what is lost. Now, that can lead to a question: what can we do? What should we do? Very good question. The problem is, if we try to answer this question on our own as individuals, a lot of us are going to come to say there's nothing we can do. The problem is too big for my actions to have any difference. How can any single person make a difference? But really, this is, as Brueggemann argues, simply another form of denial. It's not one that ignores the problems or pretends that they don't exist, but it's one that sacrifices our agency, the very thing that makes us human, in looking to solve that problem. And I'll be honest with you, this is the position that I suspect, that I know I myself have fallen into. For many years, I've said there's nothing I can do about these problems, and that we can fall into them all too easily. So instead of asking, what can we do? I say this is the wrong question to be asking, or at least the wrong starting point if we wish to do something. Instead, we can act and must act in community with others, in groups. For when we are drawn into community, lament can turn itself into a sense of hope. And I'd really like to provide a nod here to Brian from yesterday, who made an excellent point that the creation and management of the OIDA is itself a very hopeful sign for us. For Brueggemann says that hope is an utterance that arises from elsewhere. It comes from outside of the empire. It comes from outside of those faces, and says we can disrupt what is happening. We don't need to be restrained. So we can turn our personal question, what can I do, into something completely different, one that's focused on an imperative for social improvement that rises outside of ourselves, whether we call that, outside force, God or Allah, or simply our common heritage as humans, to prove it into a secular context. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about how I am trying to act in a hopeful way. And I'll be honest with you, it's hard. There are days it is very hard to see what is happening, and it's hard to keep a smile on my face, but I try. Now, I'm going to root this. I actually just returned yesterday from Ghana, and I'm collaborating with a group there. And this group is helping me develop a model for how I want to pursue my own work and respond to this reality and grief. So instead of, again, saying, what can I do? My time in Ghana has led me to really double down on this question. How are we to be? what in our deepest essence are we? What are our attributes? What is the nature of our existence on Earth? Now, this is really a reiteration of some of the oldest trends in Western culture, in other areas. Knowing yourself, physician, heal thyself. In the Bible, in humility, considers other better than yourself, doubling down on knowing yourself and then being part of community. I firmly believe we are to be open people so that we can share our true selves and our gifts with each other, with our neighbors, with our communities, with regions, nations in the world. So I'll tell you about three things that I'm involved with. I'll spend the majority of my time here on one of those projects, and then we'll talk about briefly about two others and maybe some lessons that I can draw for how the OIDA might function moving forward. So the project that I'll be describing is called Catalyzing African Community Archives for Social Good. As I say, I'm just back from some time in Ghana, which was wonderful. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. This project was actually funded by an internal grant here at the University of Illinois. So just drawing some lessons. This has been about a 2-year project. What does it mean to be open? What does it mean to really know yourself and bring yourself into community with others? First, I would argue open starts small. The project that I'm involved with, and I believe that some of my co-collaborators are on the session here, really started out of a conversation at the end of a conference, a chance meeting that led to a moment of potential transformation in community. And I think recognizing that, we have a lot of conversations with others, but being attuned and knowing when the group really can bring something forward from some small conversation is important. That said, open needs to think big. In our case, we were fortunate enough to organize a team for apply for the grant through the University Chancellor's Office, which had an initiative focusing on action and social change. And that's what ultimately brought me to Ghana 3 years later to be in community with tribal members and the Consortium of Academic and Research Libraries in Ghana. Above all, and the Africans and the Ghanaians taught me this in particular, open shows hospitality. Now I really have to say the scale and the warmth of the hospitality that I felt both in Kenya and Ghana, which I've had the privilege to visit as part of this project, surprised and shocked me because both of the groups I met with showed hospitality on a scale I had simply never witnessed before. So, for example, when I visited Kenya in 2024, when you go to Africa, things seem to operate at a slower pace. And as an American, you're kind of questioning yourself, well, why aren't we getting more done here? And you are getting more done actually at the end of the day, but it starts with this hospitality, whether it's being greeted by gospel singers or sharing in some of the local food dishes and the gift giving and all of that. So this hospitality leads to an even deeper aspect, which is where we invite each others to be part of an intentional community, live into each other's lives. And in the Catalyzing African Community Archives project, this is the community of people we had together in May of 2025 when we met at the University of Illinois. Now, open is not easy, I will tell you. Firsthand, it just isn't, particularly across cultural divides, or I can imagine also in something as complex as the OIDA. But open tells the truth when bumps in the road come along. So for the truth is, no matter how much I wanted to be in community with this project, I found that I myself had overcommitted, leading to some disappointment in tangible ways. Now, thankfully, the community was open enough in telling me the truth to hold me to account, to know where I was not living up to my own personal commitments. And ultimately, that brought the team closer together. And this is something, sometimes you learn things in the most mundane of ways. As Stefana mentioned at the beginning, I'm currently the acting head of the History, Philosophy, and Newspaper Library. And when I sat down at the desk of the permanent librarian, Celestina Savonius Roth, she had this sign hidden in a way where she could see it when she was speaking with others, but they would not necessarily be aware of it. So it's a constant reminder that we need to be truthful with ourselves at the deepest level. And then open forgives. As I said, I had to disappoint the group, but in reality, and here you see Maureen and Florence, even though the relationship was a little bit uncomfortable at the time, they went out on a limb to bring themselves to a conference where we could be together in community and begin to repair those relationships. Now, in the project, we've also very much gone into a particular African proverb, which I was taught at one time. That is this: if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. I suspect many of you have heard that before, but when the rubber hits the road and you have to do it, it can sometimes be a little bit difficult. When we started our project, even though we only had 12 months to work on it, we literally spent about 2 to 3 of those months just developing a working agreement among project members. Seemed like a lot at the time, but once we were done with that, it really allowed us to blossom. And also, you find from that point, open is very engaging. Now, we did have the opportunity to teach some training materials that we developed in the project last week. And here's just a shot of some of the community members in Africa learning and really teaching us as well, using the training materials that Florence, that Maureen, that Juliet, that Abraham, that really the whole group had helped to develop. And then open practices generosity as well. So we would and need to should practice generosity with each other. In Ghana in particular, they have this word akwaba, which is kind of like generosity on steroids. And I hope you go to get to visit Ghana someday to experience it. I experienced it firsthand in many ways. One of the smallest when we visited the Museum of the Asante Kingdom, I was on the verge of buying this small pamphlet, and one member of our team, Selikem Dorvlo from Accra Technical University, insisted on buying it for me because she wanted to be generous, and things like that really do build the team. So what does this mean for today for openness in libraries? I'm going to take my cue here from some things that were said by one of the keynote speakers at our event, which is Ellis Owusu Dabo. He's professor of epidemiology and global health at KNUST, which is one of the leading research libraries in Ghana, and former vice chancellor of the university. In his talk, he contextualized the role that libraries play in society among these three nodes, and I think they're particularly valuable for something like the OIDA, the need for trust between citizens represented through government, between academia and industry. And I think, we all know there's a loss of trust in most institutions and in society. I really appreciated what Ellis had to say because he titled his talk, The Strategic Role of Academic and Research Libraries. Now, I told the Ghanaians who I was speaking with after that I heard this talk, and it was to me one of the clearest statements actually of the role that an academic and research library can play and in fact should play in society that I have heard in the past 20 years. The core point being that libraries are not peripheral institutions. I think we often, in spite of the fact that we don't really believe that, act in that way, but they are foundational infrastructures of trust. This is particularly important because if you look at something like Pew Research did a study of libraries, I believe it was in 2017 or 18, and they found that they are one of the few trusted institutions left in society. At that time, 78% of all respondents saw them as purveyors of quality information. But we also know that there are threats to libraries, particularly if they're seen as sacrificing neutrality or hiding under a kind of false objectivity or not preserving things from different perspectives. So just to provide 3 examples of projects where I'm trying to live into that neutrality and then think a little bit about OIDA. I've already mentioned the collaborative archive and community stewardship collaborative, I should say the parent project. The specific example of it that we'll also list here is the Collaborative Archival and Community Stewardship Ghana project, which is led by Dr. Florence Plocky at Accra Technical University. We're developing workshops of co-developed training curricula to develop provide to community members and tribal leaders to preserve archival materials in communities, looking to have demonstration projects, and working also through the Consortium of Academic and Research Libraries in Ghana. At the beginning, Stefana mentioned I'm also currently director for a project I'm calling the Digital News Archive Trust. This is something for which I have applied for external funding and for which I currently have internal funding. The basic point of this is to build a distributed network of individuals who use Zotero to develop curated collections of news source across different social, political, religious, and economic uh, vectors, if you will. So neither conservative nor liberal, but really to get a sense for what Americans are reading and how it's shaping their opinion. What we would do is we would have digital news archons, we would call them, who would collect these sources and then make an archive both of news itself and of opinion shaping and formation. Another huge need that I see to build a mass archive at this moment are for humanitarian archives. As we mentioned earlier, USAID was eliminated. We know that, but we know that there are many records left. And while this is currently being fostered by a small Welsh foundation through a grant that's conducting a census of at-risk records, there are many opportunities for us to walk alongside the humanitarian community in building a mass archive. Okay, so I have about a minute left here. A lot of background. What about the OIDA in particular? I really do have to say I've not directly used the OIDA myself, but when I was getting ready for the talk and looking at it, I was deeply impressed by the types of resources that I believe it was either Beth or Stefana mentioned at the beginning. The crisis timeline, ways to integrate the OIDA into into pedagogy or into teaching, the curriculum library, the image collection, the data products, the toolbox, the events that you're hosting. Those are all the types of things that need to be done for mass digital archives. What could be done in the future? One question I have, and maybe we'll talk about this in the discussion, is, what role does commercial harvesting of the OIDA currently play? How is it being used externally? Obviously, we have researchers who are using it directly, through the use of the curated data sets or the other data sets. But is it being hammered in essence by the AI companies? One other thing that I think could be very helpful, and I'll sort of ladder these up here. I think a sort of a contextual browser for the application, finding your way through it like you would through a traditional finding aid, so that historians, something like me, somebody like me are familiar with, can use that. I also do think things can be done to make the email in it perhaps a little bit more usable. Uh, Email is a particularly fraught format to preserve. One of my other projects I'm working on is looking at, and in fact has developed a technical standard for encoding the entirety of an email message and all of its metadata into a PDF container. I also do wonder a little bit, and I'm a little bit on the fence, honestly, about some of the AI applications, knowing, what I showed in terms of the physical infrastructure and the environmental costs. But I do wonder about, and I think Paco may talk a little bit about this, um, retrieval, augmented generation based chat services, summarization. And then finally, I think one thing that could be looked at is actually the building of an LLM using the content of the OID to vectorize the content to build out social networks. So sort of laddering things up here. So I will leave it there. Again, just thank you for this opportunity. And I'm really glad now to hear from Luciana and from Paco.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, for that really thought-provoking talk. I'll just quickly remind all of our audience members that we do have a question and answer section that you are welcome to submit things to. We will take some time at the end to answer all of those. So with that, I would like to introduce Luciana Duranti.
Hello, everyone. I am going to share my PowerPoint. And let's see, come on, do it. Oh, come on. Okay. So, I am going to talk about the responsible use of artificial intelligence by archives. There is no question that the preservation of the records, especially the ones we were talking about, is extremely important, but its purpose is, in fact, to provide access to those records to everyone who is interested. And to do so, making sure that personal private information is not revealed, confidential information neither, and that the records can be proven, can be verified to be authentic. That is, to have the same identity they had when generated and the same integrity. And this has been over 28 years the purpose of the Interpares Research Project. The project has gone through several phases, and the latest phase deals with AI. Why? Primarily because the difficulty of the task of making accessible digitized records or born digital records resides in the creation of the specific data related to each record and also in the ability to identify where the private information is in the record. So archivists have thought, hey, let's use artificial intelligence for doing this. But can we trust it? So the specific goal of the fifth phase of Interpares, I Trust AI, was to design, develop, and leverage artificial intelligence to support the availability and accessibility of trustworthy public records, reliable, accurate, and authentic. So our purpose has been to identify specific technologies that can address critical records challenges, to determine the benefits and the risks of using those technologies or records, and to ensure that archival science and diplomatics inform the development of responsible AI. Now, we have carried out this work through 54 studies. Some are case studies and some are general studies. That is, they are related to all archival functions. But all the researchers in each study are international. You know, Chris was talking about going together, the difficulty of going together, where I am leading 110 researchers from 42 countries in 5 continents from several disciplines. So from computer science to archival science and history, etc. So a law in particular and different legal systems. So it is important to understand that for each study that we carry out, there are very different perspectives that have an input on the outcome of the study. The studies are organized by archival functions from creation to reference and access. Today, I want to talk specifically about one general study that concerns all records-related functions, and it is the Paradata study. It consists in developing an approach for documenting the artificial intelligence process to fulfill archival accountability in the use of AI, thereby supporting the authenticity of the outcome. So you have to understand any moment in which an archival institution starts using AI, it becomes responsible for the outcomes. The responsible if you use ChatGPT to create metadata is not Google. It's whoever uses it. It's very interesting that today I received an email out of the text encoding initiative listserv that was asking in the creation of TEI files for text generated by large language models, how do I identify the author? Well, this is what we are addressing today. The author of material generated by AI, is it AI or is it a specific individual or institution? So the researchers here are the primary researchers. There are many more than this, but these are the ones who lead the research, are from San Jose University, the University of Maryland, the Bank of Canada, and the University of Uppsala. Note that these are all from different disciplines. So we have archivists, records managers, engineers, computer scientists, economists, and historians. So what are the research questions? The questions needed to be answered when we design, deploy, or interpret the results of the application of an AI tool in archival institutions are as follows. If harm is a result, what type of harm? From what error? Why did it occur? Who should be held responsible? The data curator who assembles the data sets, the data scientist who develops the model, the vendor who supplies the tool if you get it from the vendor rather than developing it inside your archival institution, the individual or the institution that implemented the tool, the human users of the output of the tool who couldn't understand the likelihood of error. To answer these questions, we need first to understand the difference between explainable AI and accountable AI. We have talked a lot about explainable AI, but explainable AI focuses on why a tool produces an output from a set of input. So explainable AI gives you the algorithm and the data sets used. But accountable AI has to do with the persons, the organizations, the environment in which the tool is used. So the paradata is necessary to explain why, how, by whom, and to what effect a tool was used in a particular context. So how can you explain it? You can explain in a causal way how the tool functions, in an epistemic way how we know that it functions, and in a justificatory way on what grounds it functions. But justificatory goes beyond that because it must reference institutional and social facts about the implementation of the system. What were the regulations for using these tools in the institution? What were the standards used? Note that ISO developed quite a number of standards on artificial intelligence. And in the slides, you can see in the notes, there is reference to that when you will be given the slides. So in Interpares, we have developed a specific definition for paradata. And we have defined paradata as information about the procedures and the tools used to create and process information resources, along with information about the operation of the tools and the execution of the procedures, and about the persons carrying out those procedures and using the tools. So if you have in archives a specific business tool, I want to create metadata for all these digitized records. That is data that allow to identify them, right? So what do? I define the goal, I frame it as a machine learning problem. That is, I identify the sets of data that I need to educate a model that will do the job. So the data are identified, the data are processed, the model is developed, then it is deployed, then it is monitored, and if it doesn't work, we go back to the development or even to data processing. Now, Paradata is information about each one of these steps and also about the persons who have taken these steps and now they've been educated to do the work. So what's the difference between metadata and paradata? Metadata is data about a record that is needed for displaying the record, for analyzing the record, for searching the records. Now, in AI, they call it labeling. It is not. That's wrong. They're using the language in the wrong way. Okay? It is not labeling, is archival description, is describing. Okay? Labeling is a different thing. Labeling is parsing the document. So it's semantic segmentation. This is the date, this is the addressee, this is the subject matter, this is the action, this is the signature, etc. This is the letterhead. That's labeling. And labeling is extremely important for us when we use AI. And we can use diplomatics to do that. We have used diplomatics to do that. And in fact, we have taught it to all the artificial intelligence researchers in our team, and they are using diplomatics to do labeling. And labeling, of course, teaches the model, the AI model, to create the metadata. Now, paradata instead is data about methodologies, processes, and persons associated with the production and assembly of the records generated by the archives. Okay, examples. Organizational paradata are the easy one, and they can be generated ahead of the choice and use of any AI system. So what is the AI policy of the archives? What are the design plans? What is the training of the employees? The ethics, how you do the impact assessment, what is the process for implementing the use of AI, what are the regulatory requirements, etc. Then there are technical paradata, the description of the model and the algorithm, and now it has been tested and selected, the valuation and the performance metrics, the logs generated, the training data sets, the training parameters, and if you have bought the tool, you need all the vendor documentation and the versioning information. Now, there are three types of AI environment. The first one is the simple one. It is the robot thing, right? So there is, in the first type, there is no human interaction at all. There are sensors that sense, receive the stimuli for the real world. There is control processes that determine the responses to the stimuli and pass them to the actuators who have to execute the responses. And then the loop continues because the outcome of the execution becomes stimuli for the sensors and so on. So that is the simple case of a robot. We do have a robot in some archives, the ones that pick up the packages of records in the stacks. But we don't have much more than that. Then there are recommendation systems. Recommendation systems have a human in the loop, but the human in the loop is there only to accept a recommendation or reject a documentation. But the important ones are the action system. The action system, humans and the AI have shared agency. That is, they have equal amount of input, which can be contemporaneous, happen at the same time, or can be sequential. Think of a car. You can pass control to artificial intelligence. You can take it back. You can decide in an emergency who is acting and so on. We have it in the airports. The passengers traffic control is AI controlled, but there is a room upstairs where there are individual human beings who control AI and actually can correct any error. So for this kind of systems, when we use it in archives, we need general paradata and technical paradata. And the general paradata are related to the system itself, independently of its uses and operation, its governance and compliance, while the operational paradata have to do with actual sensor input, controller directions, the actions of the actuators, and the log of the sensor data, camera footage, etc. You will have these slides so you can read the details. Now, what does it mean? It means that we have lots to preserve when we use AI to carry out any archival task. That is all the information that is evidence of what happened. But the most important evidence is the evidence of the intermediary processes. So it's not so much the information in the data points produced by the process or the system output. The most important thing is the relation between the data points. How do we move from here to there? And to maintain the interdependency between these processes and the decisions formulated by the controllers is absolute key. Records must compile data sets in such a way as to make the relationships between the intermediary processes sensible and understandable. So my reflections, traditionally computer system is understood as a tool rather than as an agent. AI systems challenge this because they increase their autonomy and introduce barriers to human comprehensibility. So if the AI systems are recognized in a legal context as agents rather than as tools, you must have heard about agentic AI and all these discussions about do they make decisions? So if this happens, the record keepers need to adjust their focus. And from your point of view, say, oh, well, we just take whatever it was created and passed to us. But you have to know how this material has been generated too. It's not just what you do in the archives, is what you receive in the archives. So under existing framework, AI systems do not constitute the author responsible for the action documented. So the answer to my friend in TI is the author is whoever claims to be, not AI. So the institution who generated the documents or whatever using AI. But without legislation that recognizes the status of AI systems as juridical persons, the AI systems are not authors. But there are proposals for the implementation of legal personhood for AI systems in the European Union, making this system partially responsible for the actions in which they participate. If this happens, AI systems will no longer be mere agent of human intentions, but may comprise entities exerting agency. Now, you understand in the opioid industry, this is extremely dangerous. If it is not human beings who are making the decisions, but is AI, then who is accountable for their actions? Who is liable? So, in conclusions, the decisions made and actions taken by AI-enabled systems must be documented. Some of the documentation will be automatic. So let me go one step back. If you acquire material, part of which has been generated by AI, you have to ask for that documentation. It is not enough. You need to have all the paradata in addition to the metadata. Now, some of the documentation will be automatic as part of the AI system or tool. Some will be human created. prior to or even after the creation and implementation of the AI system. For example, the archives must have an AI policy, must have an AI procedure, etc. Well, that would exist for all the use of AI in archives. The paradata is necessary to document the AI process and to promote transparency and accountability. The captures of them and the preservation of the paradata ensures that the AI process is documented in such a way that preserves the authenticity of records, but also supports their maintenance, and I would add access over time. Now, I have listed here for you the most important publications available freely everywhere about this subject matter. They're much more detailed than what I have said, and they specify how to go about creating those data. Also, if you go to the website of Interpares Trust AI and you click on dissemination, you will also find all the papers given a symposium. Actually, you can listen to them. And you can find many other sources that talk about the findings of the research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luciana. Just as a reminder to all of our audience members, if you have any questions for Luciana or Chris, we welcome you to put those in the question and answer panel. We look forward to addressing those at the end of our talk today. So with that, I'd love to introduce Paco Nathan. Paco, please take it away.
Thank you, Stefana. My name is Paco Nathan. I'm from a company called Senzing. Let me get some slides up here to share. And alrighty. Can you see that okay? Is that coming across? Good. I'm from a company called Senzing. You may not have ever heard of us, but probably use the technology. In some places, we're involved a lot in public sector. I'll go into more detail about that. But my talk here is more about how to apply some of the graph technologies. And I'll put that in context, but I am involved a lot with teams that are doing investigations, analysis of archives in particular, generally looking for some type of criminal networks. And I'll talk about that in more detail. Again, I really appreciate it. I'm grateful to get the opportunity to present here today and join this discussion. And I've really enjoyed remarks from Chris and Luciana previously. All my slides, I have a lot of links out to resources, by the way. So all my slides are here. There's a tiny URL and there's a PDF of the slides. So as far as who I am, I'm going to just go through this briefly, but basically, I did have a foundation of a lot of math and statistics, operations, research, etc., way back when, and built on that with computer science. My interest, I formally went to study AI in grad school back in the 80s, working with Doug Lennett. If you're familiar, Doug was a really early person working in what's now called generative AI, but in machine learning in general. Frankly, he was denied tenure at Stanford because they considered his work to be too empirical, which was, and the punchline of that is some of the professors later invested in Google. Anyway, I took an interest in a topic called neural networks back in the mid 80s. And got to do a lot of work in that area, seeing the rise of deep learning. Certainly, there was a long period where nobody cared about machine learning. A lot of my work was more in language, sort of computational linguistics, natural language processing. A lot of people weren't so interested for a while, so I did more network engineering, more cyber. And eventually, I got tapped by a team that had a new thing coming out of Seattle. You know them now as Amazon AWS. My teams got to be guinea pigs early on in terms of cloud. And because of that, I got tapped by a team at Berkeley and was invited to join a little startup back when we all fit in one room, called Databricks. So I've seen a lot of this infrastructure growing, and definitely been in some of the early parts of that. I tend to work more on the use cases though, and I'm with Senzing, and in particular, I'm going to present about some of the graph practices that I think are very salient to the practice of analyzing archives. In particular, in recent past, for instance, I'd been on the Rich Context project out of NYU, which was looking at archives for the purpose of evidence-based policymaking, working very closely with the libraries, excellent libraries at NOAA, and also with Deutsche Bundesbank, et cetera. So let me just introduce a bit about graphs. I love this quote from Abhishek Nagaraj: think of data as an imperfect map of the underlying entities. So whether we're talking about data sets in data warehouses, or whether we're talking about email archives or PDF archives, research papers, etc., there's this kind of connectedness of entities and relations among them. And so we do see graphs being very, very useful for understanding and navigating the analysis of these kinds of resources. Graphs are about representation. And I can't emphasize that enough. If you're familiar with some of these areas of computer science, really we're trying to work off of representation and representation learning. It's something that's been done for many years. It's actually become more and more a core in the field of AI. Although it's generally more obscure. It's only recently in the past year that a lot of the graph technologies have gone more mainstream. So for instance, I was just at the Knowledge Graph conference in Manhattan last week, and I think our attendance doubled. We sold out for the first time ever. We're seeing a lot more of the graph work, but it's also something that's maybe not as well understood. I also want to make a key point that as far as AI is concerned, I've been in this game for 45 years. A lot of the definitions I use are probably going to be substantially different than what you're going to read out of media or hear from press releases from tech firms. And a key point there is that AI is a practice; it's not a thing. A yardstick there is, if there's an article or a pronoun adjacent to AI, it's probably misinterpreted or misused. So I tend to work with people who are pretty much, for any given issue, are going to be on the opposite side of the fence of a lot of what you're hearing out of Silicon Valley. And also, I do a lot of work in public sector, defense, intelligence, sort of the intersection of where global finance meets with the intelligence community, and how that percolates out into different public sector use cases, a lot of law enforcement. A lot of the work that I do is outside the US these days, more toward teams based in UK, Australia, Singapore, EU, etc. As far as graphs, there's a lot of flexibility, but it's also, you really need to understand what you're doing, because technically it can lead to a lot of issues. I think there's a lot of temptation for people coming into working with graph technologies to say, hey, why don't we just represent everything in an enterprise, all of the data, put it into a graph. That may not be the wisest approach, but definitely there are people talking about it. But certainly it's something that can incorporate, again, a lot of different types of data and content. And you may have heard the term graph theory, especially when I'm working with more academic audiences. And graph theory itself has precious little to do with any of this. What was popularized as graph theory coming out of Budapest and elsewhere, frankly, it's a very narrow area of mathematics, and it requires highly specialized assumptions that are great for proving theorems, but not really good for practical work. And the other thing that's also a little bit discouraging, but maybe it's an opportunity, is that when you look in graph technology, there's a lot of different camps. They don't really know each other. They don't really talk with each other. They don't present at the same conferences. The companies involved in one won't be involved as much in another area. So there's a lot of room for essentially speaking across the tribal identifications. And I'll try to show some of that. Ideally, when we're working with graphs, one of the most important things for the entities in the graph is to have some kind of unique identifiers, some kind of consistent footprint for them. And there's a lot of these when you're looking at, DOIs or ISBNs. Obviously, I'm speaking to an audience that knows a lot about library science, probably preaching to the choir here. But I work a lot in the area of more legal entities. So people, organizations, maybe maritime vessels, and the consequences for identifying them, and also the consequences for what happens when it gets wrong, when those identifications are wrong. We tend to work in an area that is not, say, machine learning models being deployed in production, but more a matter of evidence handling and having high accountability, having audit trails for chain of evidence for any decisions that are made, because frankly, a lot of our customers, they're preparing to go into court. So I am more on that side of the fence. Another thing that I'll point out, if you are familiar working with graphs, one thing that is kind of appalling is people start building out a graph and they start having a lot of very creative work toward describing many, many types of relations. Usually that's an anti-pattern. I will point to some excellent writings and talks by a good friend of mine, Mike Dillinger, who led graph work at LinkedIn and prior to that at eBay. Realistically, from their perspectives, what their findings are, whatever work you put into curating the relations and really tightening how those are defined, there are order of magnitude more implications downstream than the work that you're putting into curating the entities. And that's kind of the opposite of what people who are trained to work with traditional SQL, relational data warehouses, et cetera, tend to think. So, if you've got more than a half dozen kinds of relations in your graph, you might want to think carefully. That's maybe a little bit too limiting. It's probably more on the order of a couple dozen at max, but something to keep in mind, the relations are really the important part of what you're leveraging. And so a kind of takeaway from just introducing about graphs, here's actually an investigation of on the right-hand side, there's a graph that was generated having to do, I'll show a little bit later, but it was for some research regarding risk of dementia based on nutrition. Some key points I want to make is data and content are inherently connected. When people communicate with each other, our languages are almost inherently recursive. Comedians make callbacks on stage. People refer to citations and to concepts that have been introduced in other parts of a text. So there's a kind of graphiness, a kind of connectedness in the way that we represent what goes into content or data. And we want to find ways of taking advantage of that. I also want to talk about semantics. There's a lot of uses of this word. I tend to be more on the side that is what would be called computable semantics, something that can be audited, something that can be understood programmatically. And I'll show a bit more about that. The other key takeaway is that graph is about representation, and representation is typically to focus on domain context. Not trying to boil the ocean, not trying to do a Wikipedia where you have everything and anything, but more, how can we focus on a given domain and having very clear concepts understood within the context of that domain, such that we communicated to people outside of the domain. And another key point too, I think is really important to stress, typically the use cases, as I've seen, are almost always about leveraging graph algorithms. These are what are needed. Whereas if you talk to the vendors, they're going to push you toward a graph database, they're going to push you toward doing graph queries, and those are usually what is not needed. Graph queries are great for people who know how to do SQL and want to do a graph query, but frankly, a lot of it is pointed toward vendor lock-in. And if you've got a graph use case and the first discussions about what graph database we're going to be using, it's already gone off the rails. So think about the use case, think about the graph algorithms that are needed, and I'll show a little bit of that. Overall, leveraging graphs is a great way to improve data quality and insights, also to mitigate the errors downstream, such as where there are AI applications that might be using entirely wrong sets of entities and relations. You want to try to tighten that down. And I think in the near term as well as the long term, what we're talking about here is I come from a background of doing both the more symbolic side of AI, which is much more accountable and explainable, as well as doing more of the statistical machine learning. which is what's currently in vogue with LLMs. And LLMs are not a panacea. They are not capable of doing everything. There's a lot of hubris out there in the marketplace. Please take it with a grain of salt. Um, Neurosymbolic is an umbrella for understanding how you can have hybrids. They use the best of both worlds, both like I say, the statistical machine learning, as well as the more symbolic kinds of reasoning. And there's a really excellent conference about this called NESSI. And there's a researcher who I think is predominant in this field, Frank van Harmelen out of Netherlands. Definitely point toward them for more examples of what AI really can be right now, even though Silicon Valley tends to overlook this wholesale. So let me just introduce real quick what we work on and see if this might fit for some of your areas. I think talking about specifically the OIDA archives, looking at email analysis, some of this may not apply immediately, but downstream, I think so. But I just want to give some context to where I come from. Here's an article by Jeff Jonas, who founded the company I work at. We're a small team, about 30 people, engineering team. Most everybody there has been together for more than 25 years. I joined a couple of years ago. I got invited to join this team that's been longstanding. But we've had a lot of years working in this area of essentially identity intelligence. And by that, I mean trying to understand explainably, accountably, who is who, what is what. Really focusing on people, organizations, again, sometimes maritime vessels, anything that has a legal identity, and if you get it wrong, they could probably sue you back. And this is a slide from work that was done back in the 80s. Jeff Jonas had started at the Mirage even before they opened. The team started out of Las Vegas, working in the casinos. Casinos were combating the influence of organized crime. So this is showing what was called non-obvious relationship awareness. Again, how to leverage a graph to show, okay, well, we've got some employees, we've got some people who used to work here, we've got some people on sanctions lists that cannot be allowed into the casino or will lose our gambling license. We've got loyalty club members. And, one of the first things they found out was there were mob bosses who were being sent first-class tickets and then, luxury suite accommodations because they were working under false identities. That was, something they wanted to get rid of. And this was acquired by IBM, then later spun out. But it's really this kind of ideas. How can we find a lot of the relationships that might not be obvious on the surface, but they have a lot of consequences? And so just the technology itself is about, if you're familiar with computer science, a lot of computer science in terms of programming languages, in terms of even like SQL queries or machine learning models, almost all of that is based on binary kinds of logics. There are many kinds of formal logics. This is more pointed toward what we would call unary logics, which are what justices use in court. So the kind of evidence trail that's used in court is typically more of a unary logic, or more specifically a boundary logic. And that's what we're trying to establish, is based on the records coming across from your data, how can we kind of triangulate a footprint of entities for people, organizations, maybe vessels, across your data, and show the evidence that supports decisions from merging or unmerging. And it's really important because, for instance, the majority of voter registration in the US goes through this technology. And there's a lot of arguments about voter fraud, and you really have to supply evidence to support that, because you're getting gunned from all sides. So that's probably our hardest use case, but this is also used a lot in anti-fraud. There's dark money flows of about $3 trillion a year. And the money laundering that is at the core of that is what's being used to finance, whether we're talking about human trafficking or illegal political influence campaigns, government payoff of officials for corruption, also illegal weapons transfer, on and on and on. So we're looking at a lot of kinds of network crime, and usually when you pull a thread, of something like illegal cigarettes being sold without a license, you'll find out that they're also dealing weapons. They're also involved with human trafficking. They're also being funded by a Russian oligarch, and they're involved in some illegal weapons trade, et cetera, et cetera. So we try to build up these graphs to describe what's going on with really clear identification of the entities involved and the relationships among them. And it's very difficult when you're working globally because, if I have this individual, Abdullah Qadash, and I go from whatever dialect in Al-Luqat al-Arabiyya translated into, say, English, that could go 5 different ways that are all legitimate depending on the dialect. If he's made a pilgrimage, he might have Al-Hajj. If his dad's famous, he might have Bin Amir suffix. There's a different kind of very different kinds of nicknames that are used in Arabic dialects. And you have to understand the cultural norms and not just do string comparisons, but actually dig in and understand what does this mean culturally. And nicknames in Arabic are very different than nicknames in Russian or nicknames in Korean. So we have to understand that context and be able to make very, very difficult decisions sometimes, support those. But then in contrast, like for voter registration at the bottom, if you've got John R. Smith and John E. Smith, they're just one letter off, but they're different people. So again, the cultural norms really dictate how to do this appropriately, and it must be based on evidence. And that's kind of work we do. And we've worked with linguists and cultural experts in 80 different globalizations over a period of decades. But at the end of the day, when you run entity resolution, it does generate building blocks for graphs. So that's why I've come in. We see a lot of graph work that's tangential to, especially in public sector where we're working. And to put this in more context, here is someone who is a librarian by training. I work with Jessica Talisman, excellent article talking about the kind of work that we're doing and really how this fits in the larger scope. Jessica had done work at DOJ and Amazon, others, but she does come from a very strong library science background. Similarly, I would point to other experts like Lulit Tesfaye, who also from a library science background. Basically, they're the counterpoint to a lot of the nonsense in AI currently. We're finding that in the enterprise use of AI or trying to grapple with what's coming out of Silicon Valley, it's actually the librarians who are coming to the rescue. Here, this is an article that Jessica and I worked on together, and we're trying to show how to work with different graph sources, some structured, some unstructured content, how to work with, a small lightweight taxonomy to really provide some rhyme and reason for how things are being linked together. And then from there, ultimately to build out a graph that we can take action on. And I should also just explain, this is probably the most common question I get, but you may have heard of named entity recognition, which is natural language technology when you're working with unstructured content to extract entities. I work in an area called entity resolution. They sound a lot alike. They're completely different. NER is about unstructured data. ER is about structured data, but they work together for instance, you can build a thesaurus from ER that then will customize the NER for your domain. Okay, so I want to shift a bit. I'm going to give a lot of time for questions, but I want to shift into some examples that might be more salient here. For instance, here is someone who was very much lauded by Papa John's as being one of their really stellar franchisees in South London. It turned out he was using a lot of shell companies to do large-scale tax evasion. He was subsequently prosecuted and into prison. He's actually back out now and I guess starting up again. But Abasin Badshaw, and he was working with some shell companies. So this is a typical kind of case. We had data from open sanctions and open ownership here in blue and red, respectively. I should say that I work a lot with defense, intelligence, law enforcement, but also a lot with investigative journalisms, open data, open source intelligence, et cetera. So kind of working the intersection there. Here's a case where we're using some open data, and I want to use this to illustrate a kind of pattern that we see so common in investigations that are leveraging graphs. Number one, bring your sources, your data sources together and work on data quality. That's where entity resolution helps. Then number two, take a large scale graph and partition it into subgraphs, which are meaningful networks. here is just the Badshaw network. And then number three, you can leverage graph algorithms, for instance, like betweenness centrality, to try to understand really who are the pivotal players and where should you prioritize more investigation. And then number four, take these subgraphs and run them through case management tools so you can have people collaborating on them. So if you take just the raw data, it might be a little bit connected, but then you apply this kind of approach, suddenly it becomes much more connected and the central player pops up in the middle. You can think of this almost like running PageRank. And so that's one approach, and we've got some tutorials about that, but it's a typical pattern that we see. Another case I'd point to probably overlaps a lot better is the Azerbaijani laundromat. So if you're not familiar, it's estimated that the Estonia branch of Danske Bank was involved after the global financial crisis during the mid 2010s. This one bank branch was involved with about 800 billion euros of money laundering, mostly orchestrated out of Moscow. And there's a lot of analysis in history. I'm going to focus on $3 billion of that, which was a network based out of the government elites from Azerbaijan, where this happened. It's well known. There's a lot of corruption downstream. Nobody's gone to jail yet. There's been one trial in Germany last year, but we would not have known about this except for the fact that somebody realized that Putin was very much involved in this, and he leaked 17,000 transactions. And so we at least have optics on those 17,000 transactions. And I've been doing a series of tutorials called How to Get Started in Money Laundering. Basically, on the left-hand side, you can see the transactions. It turns out a lot of it, they're bogus invoices and other collateral for the bank, but there were 4,000 wire transfers in the data. And trying to understand line by line what's going on is very difficult. And this is why so much of this fraud and corruption gets through. But by leveraging some very simple graph techniques, even without a lot of prior knowledge about the domain, boom, you can have a graph which shows exactly what was going on for 500 shell companies involved in this. What were their roles? Where was the money really flowing? And then you can see the 4 nodes there, which were where all the $3 billion was taken out. So it's a way of prioritizing investigations and really understanding the analysis. Also, there's open source for this. And a third one, I'll point out, we were talking about GraphRag earlier. I like to show examples of doing very sophisticated graph plus LLM for AI applications. This one in particular, it uses resources that can run on your laptop. They do not require a data center. And that's one of the biggest points of confusion coming out of Silicon Valley, is the need for all these data centers. It's just really hubris, and it's for political reasons. So anyway, here's an open source project that I use as a tutorial. It leverages a lot of unstructured content as well as some structured data and a small taxonomy. It's based off of the Alzheimer's research that was conducted out of Harvard, a 40-year study looking at the risk of red meat versus other types of nutrition. And we go through a very structured process. We talk about all the steps that are required. But if you wanted to take this and run with it, it's very adaptable for other types of analysis in this area. And it would be, I think, a more accountable way of leveraging some of the AI tooling, but also being able to do it even within like a air-gapped environment if you want to. At the heart of this is something called Gliner, which is a bidirectional transformer. It's not an LLM. It actually works better than LLMs for doing the entity extraction. Again, if you're doing work with email archives, this can come in very handy. And I'm trying to show ways to integrate tools like this. Anyway, so there's a lot of resource links here if you want to try to run with that. And I think I'll just kind of close and say, graphs may be something that you haven't been working with before, but there's a lot of opportunities there. If you're looking within archives, one of the things we learned off of rich context is there's a lot of implicit links that we can leverage the tooling to be able to surface those implicit links and make the graphs richer. That's something certainly that works in the case of email. And also, once you've started to build out a graph, look for opportunities to backfill with reference data, whether that is coming from data providers, open data, open source intelligence, et cetera. Reference data is a lot more powerful, I think, than most people understand. And I've got some links there about it. And I will point to GraphGeeks, which I think was actually my introduction to the team here for OIDA. We have a vendor neutral community of a lot of practitioners in this area, a lot of people who are very helpful. And if you're in the Seattle area, we've got a mini conference, 1-day conference coming up. It's more of a practitioner gathering, but that'll be at the end of July. And there's a Knowledge Graph conference just happened. Data Centric Architecture Forum out of Denver, near Denver, is coming up a little bit next month. And then in London, also one of the big conferences is Connected Data London. I'll be co-chairing that, one of the track hosts. And if you want to catch me, I do a monthly podcast with experts in this area called Graph Power Hour. I'm very open to please link up with me on LinkedIn. My link contact info is there. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paco, for that great talk. I'll just include a final reminder to all of our audience members to please take advantage of that Q&A section of our Zoom. We'd love to hear from you and have you interact directly with all of our great panelists here. I'll start, I guess, with the first question here, which is, I think when we talk about libraries in particular, we know we're often in a sort of resource constrained environment. Chris, I know you touched a little bit on sort of the USAID impacts, certainly at Johns Hopkins that has been in the news here is really affecting us, but certainly across, libraries, museums, and archives as well. So, comparing that to sort of AI, we know that it is extremely resource intensive, both in terms of, finances and also environmental impact. So, kind of with all of that in mind, I'm wondering if each of you could kind of share initial thoughts about what, an effective first step might be for libraries and archives to approach some of the methods all of you have discussed, given these resource constraints, and how that might be approachable to say smaller archives. So you might be on mute.
I'm happy to jump in here, and of course, very interested to see what Luciana and Paco have to say as well. I would really like to reiterate that extremely important point Paco made about not needing to run these tools on some big data center somewhere or using some technology that's going to have a huge environmental impact that, several of us, myself included, might see as particularly unsalutary. I'm not directly involved in this project, but at my own institution, we have an archivist, Bethany Anderson, and a digital humanities librarian and a history student who also has background in computer science, who are developing a desktop-based tool that essentially builds out a graph with any given set of documents and then makes it browsable. And what I really like Paco, what you were saying is it really does need a mix of structured and unstructured data. We had tried to do this kind of with totally unstructured data, and you end up with this spaghetti-like mass of, connections that you don't really understand that actually don't represent reality. So I think archives are really well placed for this in a way, because if you take the core principle of archival arrangement and description, which was hierarchical inheritance, you already have some context that can then be built out a little bit more. So I would just encourage people to actually try those tools out. They don't require as much expertise as you might think they do at first. And then the other one I put in the chat that only us panelists can see, and Paco, I wanted to mention to you, here in the US anyway, we have this archival tool for email called ePad, and it does what you're talking about. It builds out it builds out a graph of named entity relationships. I did like your point about the relationship and the nature of it being so important. It's not just one thing of saying these two are related to each other, but what's the verb connecting them? And I would just encourage people to try the tools out, on a small data set. You don't have to run it in Amazon or Gemini or whatever. You can use these on your laptop. So, yeah.
So my turn. So as it regards money, uh, I would suggest to libraries and archives to associate themselves with research teams because we got this gigantic grant and over renewed 5 times over 28 years, which basically pays for all the expenses for postdocs and PhD students working with computer scientists, developing tools basically for free. For example, we have developed for UNESCO, for the UNESCO archives, a tool which is able to create metadata for all their recorded interviews. And basically, they have digitized the interviews. They are in 74 different languages. That's not an easy thing to do. Uh, and we have used postdocs in linguistics and computer science to work on this, and we have developed that. We have developed using graph theory and led by Carleton University in Ottawa by Michel Bourbeau, who is a professor of computer scientist, but also the university in Colorado, whose name will come to me in a minute, where they have in a way criticized RIC, the records in context. They think that it is the graph theory is used, but in the wrong way. So I will not take the time to explain. Um, so yes, the money is solved by associating yourself with somebody who has the money and can help you, because certainly institutions like archives, especially if they are part of a larger institution, they're not going to get enough money for this, because what costs more is also the compute time during which you use this material. So, and graph theory has been extremely useful to develop methodologies to identify the authenticity of images, whether they were generated by AI or by individuals. So, yeah, all of this we have talked about supports the largest endeavor of ensuring that we have accessible, authentic records. The problem is that this knowledge tends to be separated. So we should have programs that are interdisciplinary enough in which we teach special, Paco, I taught a course last year to computer scientists called Accountable Computer Systems. And you see, together with the computer scientists, so he would present a system and I would start putting holes into it and taking it apart. But it is important to be interdisciplinary at this point. We can't have this separation among disciplines any longer.
I'll just add that, yeah, you can really do a lot of work with a laptop. There's so much open source available, and there's so much that can be done. Even graphs that have tens of millions of elements in them, I can run on my laptop. There's a lot of hubris about the need for data centers, but if you look at people like Open Sensors, for instance, was part of the team that built TensorFlow at Google, worked inside of Google, and eventually left because they were showing how to do a lot of the applications currently very low power, very low footprint, but every time they turned around, Google was forcing them to use Google Cloud. So I think that there's a lot of hubris out in the industry. Take it with a grain of salt. There's a lot can be done with your own resources. Frankly, the hard problems are not on the technology side. The hard problems are more language and culture, and really understanding the context of what's going on in investigations.
I think you're definitely talking to an audience too of librarians who certainly are familiar with name disambiguation issues. I think it's something a lot of us come across, certainly. So I appreciate that. We also got a great comment here that it's so great to hear about effective tools for large scale studies that can be run on a laptop, not a data center. And we hope that they hear more about this in the mainstream media. I think it's true. There's I don't think some of the smaller or more easily run tools are quite as strongly known about. So that's really great to hear. Um, Gianna, I have a question for you in particular from one of our audience members. The question reads, how can archival institutions practically capture and preserve paradata from AI systems in a way that ensures authenticity, especially when many AI processes are proprietary or not fully transparent to users? So just understanding that AI is often a black box, and how can we make that transparent when we don't necessarily have that transparency ourselves?
Well, no, we have to have that transparency. That's the entire point, is that if we get from a vendor a tool, we need the vendor together with all that information that is listed in the slides that I gave you, because we don't want to use any tool without having that information. As to the tools that we ourselves develop together with the researchers that we have developed, like the one for UNESCO. In the process of developing it, we document the whole thing, all the testing, all the data sets and everything. How do we preserve it? Well, the same way we preserve all digital material. This is digital information that we preserve in our digital preservation systems, and we have standards for doing that. Now, you may tell me it is an enormous amount of stuff to preserve. True. And it requires money and resources. Absolutely true. So the fact that we have developed the tools and we have all the paradata and we can do all the work doesn't mean that we can continue using it without additional resources.
Thank you for that. I have another question from one of our audience members. This one is for Paco. The attendee asks, how should we detect relationships that are evolving?
Great, thank you. And that comes from El. Hi, El. Great question. Definitely that is the nature of the beast, is that the whole landscape is evolving the whole time. I would say that relationships do evolve somewhat more slowly than typical kinds of reactions people have toward modeling and representation. But it's important to understand, especially if you're working at very large scale. So, for instance, I was mentioning about Mike Dillinger and a lot of what he's published about what they found at LinkedIn. LinkedIn has this enormous graph, but it's all based off of user-generated content. So if you really dig into it and analyze it, you might have 50,000 different ways of saying that somebody is a software engineer, whereas there might only be 2 or 3 ways of saying that somebody is a registered nurse. So it's very imbalanced, and it's all just a lot of noise, and it's all evolving. There are ways technically that we can look at this, and I'm not going to go too deep into manifold theory and use of hypergraph embeddings. And there are good ways that we can get a handle on large scale data, seeing how it's evolving over time. And there's more and more of that becoming available in open source. But generally speaking, the drift is not as fast as in some other areas.
Really interesting. Thank you. And I also have a question here for Chris. What archival governance model can be used to balance community ownership of Indigenous archives with institutional preservation standards?
Right. So whoever asked that, thank you very much. It sort of seems a little bit at first glance like it's not related to the OIDA, but in a way it is, because with every set of records that you have, they're ultimately is and needs to be a responsible owner or steward of those materials. I think in the past, a lot of our archival governance models were, because most archives come out of institutions, see the institution itself as the owner or the curator or the steward of those materials. When you look at something like the OIDA, for instance, because it comes out of a legal settlement, it sits within a particular set of governance rules that regulate that make it not really an institutional record in the same way we would think. I mean, these are no longer Purdue Farmers archives, right? They're at this point, they're an archives that's really managed for the public benefit. I think when you start to see bigger indigenous archives getting built, and there's a whole set of theory behind this that, you know, many archivists whose shoulders I stand on and whose work I haven't even fully read yet have developed. But the core point comes down to those records need to be curated and, in essence, controlled and organized by the community's needs and by the community's standards. So, for example, you know, as I mentioned, I was just in Ghana, and I had the privilege of visiting the Asante Palace, which is in Kumasi. The Asante have a very different structure for their society, and in my estimation, a really interesting way of organizing their governance. And to manage their archives outside of that governance model, it just doesn't make sense, right? Because the community determines it. So you really do need to take your cue from the community. I think with institutional archives, we have a particular history of operating in with a sort of set of colonialist assumptions that we should own and control those materials, and that just simply no longer applies any longer. Now we can have access to them and we can co-curate them, but really the protocols need to be established by those communities in conjunction with us and prejudicing their particular needs, interests, wants, legal regimes.
That's really interesting, and I think a great segue to a question that I have for Paco, which is that you know, your work has supported, as you mentioned, a number of government investigations. You know, clearly what we have in OIDA reflects an enormous amount of sort of legal work. But hopefully, we hope that one of the use cases for OIDA is that it can be leveraged for future legal work, new people bringing new suits. And you know, as the repository for these, what advice would you give us to sort of be responsive to our users and their use cases in that context?
So preparing for eventual use in more legal use cases downstream. Interesting. Well, I mean, one thing that comes to mind about that, there are some controlled vocabularies that might be very useful for the kinds of representations you're making. So, for instance, one of the things we see in cross agency and public sector or between public and private, there's something called NAME, which was, you know, after 9/11, there was kind of a post-op, and it was determined that there were critical messages that literally were dropped between different agencies because they didn't have a consistent schema, and so they literally could not get messages across during an emergency. And so NAME arose as a way of having more standardized communication across organizations. And you don't have to use all of it, but using some of it, just so that people downstream will understand the actual intent of representation is very important. So, for instance, NEAM, if you're familiar with Amber Alerts, and Amber Alert goes out about a child, that has to cross 10,000 different organizations, all the telcos, all the law enforcement agencies, all the, you know, federal, state, local agencies, etc. And so how can we communicate across these different cultures, so to speak? Kind of gets back to some of what Chris was saying just a moment ago. So I think, you know, working with people who understand some of the semantics that need to be used, and again, more computable semantics that are agreed taxonomies coming out of NIST or coming out of, depending where it's coming from, there's a lot of kinds of vocabularies that you can put together for an application. And the more that I'm hearing from the intersection of AI firms and law, as I should say, not AI firms, more applications in law of AI, the more that they're putting a premium. If you look at, say, YHOW or some of the others, more they're putting a premium on having that kind of semantic representation because it's so useful.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I certainly imagine we might come back to pick brain about that someday. Um, Chris, there's another question for you in the Q&A. The question is that you mentioned the role of commercial harvesting, and if there are any rails that archives can put on their records to manage that. And that's certainly, I'll say, something we've considered at OIDA too. We know that AI companies are eager to grab our documents. And yeah, I would be really interested on your perspective in that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And I mean, I'll could say a few things here and then see what Paco and Luciana have to say as well. Our experience with this has been that here in the library is that at Illinois has been the commercial companies and AI harvesters right now are going after like newspaper content and genealogical data in a really big way. So we have a newspaper archive for Illinois, and it was just getting hammered to the point where it was basically like a DDO, distributed denial of service sort of thing, where we'd have hundreds of connections from Romania and Thailand and Suriname, you name it, at one time. And you can deal with those things with some commercial software. We use Cloudflare, that comes with a cost. I haven't seen them kind of coming after archival materials yet, but I expect that when they start to run out of training data, through published sources, they're going to sort of come after it. I think it's an interesting question because, as libraries, we are, I mean, as I said, we are about open. That's what we are. We want things to be accessible. We need people to download and use them. And that's our fundamental commitment, our fundamental stance, if you will. But in the environment we're operating in, the very thing that is your fundamental commitment can be used by bad actors to undermine that very commitment, right? And that, you can make a whole argument about democracy about that, and others have made it better than I can. So I think there are a variety of ways you can do it. You can require people to register, you can put Cloudflare in place, but it really comes down to both the practical question of is your service still available, but also the philosophical question, how open do you want to be?
Yeah, I think that is definitely certainly a very philosophical question, especially in the library space. Paco, Luciana, do either of you have anything you'd like to add there?
No, was thinking that yesterday the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, won the prize for the development of the C2PA, the standard of the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity for AI. It developed a process for using it automatically for any information image related that it receives, so that nothing that is shown on any program of the CBC has not passed through this verification, this standard verification, so that it is accurate. Yeah, you can look in the news is the most recent thing, but it is very important because now the standard is embedded in all the cameras, and they cost lots of money, of course. In Leica in particular is the most expensive, but for the purposes of journalists, you want to be able to prove that your video is authentic, that was not created by AI. And so basically everything they show in the news now, from whatever source, has to go through the verification, through this process and verification. So
I'll just add, yeah, I definitely use Cloudflare and know some of the folks around there. There is a free tier. So if you do want to get some protection from essentially distributed on service or just being hammered by bots, there's a free tier. They're actually interested in getting optics on where the attacks are coming from. So it's in their best interest to make some of the services as widely available as possible. Yeah. The other thing I'll say is kind of a corollary with that is understanding cyber. the nature of cyber threat, and just the significance of it, the impact of it, and especially with what is being called AI. I think there's way too much hubris about the importance of AI for conducting threats. There's some concerns there, but like for instance, Anthropic had, this big announcement about Mythos recently, and how their new technology is so powerful that they can't make it available for public inspection, and it's just so bogus. Open Mythos came out less than a week later, and arguably they've had some very good falsifiability claims to show that what they deconstructed is actually very close to what's being used. And the reality is, like in cyber, you generally want to fuzz a system, just throw random stuff at it, and then there's a suite of tools to try to understand, okay, where are the vulnerabilities, where are the threat vectors. And what Anthropic was doing there was just to put in an LLM instead of the randomization, but then they use the tools like everybody's been using. And we know that these vulnerabilities are out there, and there's not a lot of will on the part of corporate leadership to really do much about them. But the thing about Mythos that was interesting, if you look at Mosaic and others, the corporate executives responded right away because they didn't want to look bad about having been caught unawares because of AI. It had nothing to do with AI. It had to do with the fact of just like, when are they actually going to spend the money? So I think understand what's going on in terms of cyber threat, because it will have a lot of impact on anybody who's having resources available publicly, and also understand that there's a lot of nonsense going on in the public rhetoric.
Well, thank you for that. We have one more question. It reads, we've heard a bit about GraphRag today as one example, but what are some other examples of emerging tools and interfaces enabled by AI that function as new kinds of finding aids, things that would empower users to better explore archives like OIDA?
Okay, fantastic question. I mean, RAG, people talk about a lot, actually, retrieval augmented generation. It's basically, if you roll back about 10 years ago and you do a Google search, you get 10 blue links. The idea of RAG is, let's go ahead and grab the content for those links and run them through summarization. And so LLMs are very good at summarization. Generative or abstractive summarization has arguably gone through a lot of innovation over the past few years. But the overall process of information retrieval didn't change. And so I think there's a lot of corporate shell games being played there, talking about, this is AI. Realistically, it's still leveraging the recommender systems that were being used years ago. GraphRag is different in the sense of, now we're bringing in something that fits more with library science, something that's more accountable, using graphs that have semantics that are agreed on by a wide audience. And how can we use more of the symbolic side to make sense out of, say, what was going on in vector search? Vector embeddings are a little bit problematic because they're brittle. They're very good at looking at things that are immediately close to them. They're not good at all for following a trace. So if you say cat, and then there's some interesting data report that's associated with the word kitten, they'll miss that entirely. Whereas with a graph, they would find that. So GraphRag is interesting. I also did an article at O'Reilly. If you look at the work in GraphRag, there's maybe 8 different definitions for the word graph there. So, and Microsoft did not invent it. They were actually late to the party, but everybody thinks they invented it. But I think overall, to your question, there's a lot that's available. Looking at patterns and looking at embeddings as a representation of patterns. So put your data in a graph and find where there are consistent patterns. We did some work with Esri recently, looking at illegal fishing and finding patterns with these kind of technologies where, ships that were owned by the same entity in another country were operating off of almost identical patterns off the coast of Peru as they were off the coast of Norway. They're just following a playbook. And a lot of the pattern analysis really came out of life sciences, where protein expressions were arguably a lot simpler than people. But still, we see in more the social context, there's a lot of work for understanding these kinds of patterns. And again, I talked about manifold theory and what's going on there. If you want to talk about that more, it's outside the scope of what we can say here. But I would say that is especially where we could go beyond today's AI.
So I put the name there. One of the products that we have created is called Clio X, and it is for distant reading. It has been developed by the team led by Vicky Lemieux. And it is basically doesn't acquire the material of the archives, but had access to it and is able to selectively find what is needed without acquiring it, just giving access to it. So it requires lots of time to describe, but there is lots online, and also on the website of Interpares Trust AI, there is a presentation by Vicky of the system and how it works. It is blockchain based, but it is very effective, and we have used it quite a bit.
And then I would just add, well, I mentioned during my presentation here at the University of Illinois, I have two colleagues that are working on a tool which is not yet publicly available, but it's through a grant that was funded by NEH and then withdrawn, and then apparently we funded it internally, and now NEH has been restored. But it is essentially intended to build an archival context browser where you would take as inputs both the metadata that you have. So, for example, this document is contained in a folder of this title, which is in a collection named X, Y, or Z, and then also build out a set of relationships. And I'm actually going to investigate now, Paco, to see if they're using this graph rag technology, because that's so fascinating to me. Build out an additional set of relationships that might not be as apparent using the physical structure of the collection. And this can take as input like, PDF, Word documents, other sorts of common file formats. So I think to answer the questions, there are a lot of things that are kind of being experimented with and on the cusp of being developed. And I mean, I don't want to say archivists had a huge amount of foresight, although I'd like to think that we did. But we've been wanting to see this sort of context-aware systems for a long time. So I actually had a question, Paco, if we were, just to get oriented to this graph rag technology, because it's new to me. I'm aware of rag and had read about it, but where would I start to learn about graph rag as a supplemental newer sort of thing?
Well, great question. There's a lot of open source tutorials out there. I gave a link in my talk to a
I might have
tutorial
missed it.
I
Yeah.
I developed. It's called Scriptura. I can grab it real quick. Let me find. Unfortunately, most of my open source projects have Welsh names for various reasons, and so anyway, this one actually means structure in Welsh. Let me take it up here. There's a large article that goes around, and I tend to err on the side of a lot of citations. So, if you want to read an 8,000 word article that breaks it down step by step with a lot of primary sources and other tutorials elsewhere, that might be a good starting point.
Thank you so much. I'd like to just take a second to thank all of our speakers. I'm going to hand it back to Beth to close us out.
All right. Well, I want to echo Stefana and just thank our panelists, Paco, Chris, and Luciana for their perspectives, the things that they shared on other projects, and how they can relate to OIDA. One of the things that Chris mentioned about trust in libraries, from my perspective, I think is something that we do really value. Thinking of libraries and archives, we're seen as trusted places of information. As we look at engaging with AI, which AI can mean so many different things, thinking about where the responsibility lies. And so I really loved when Luciana was talking about using Paradata. I was also thinking about, as a lot of library vendors just are trying to sort of shoehorn AI into a lot of our tools, knowing some of the questions to ask and just what we should be pushing back on so that we can continue to serve as places of trusted information. And Paco's talk was also fascinating to me. And I think what I can understand from it also relating to some of those with maybe the OIDA archives, using some of these tools and seeing some previously unrealized relationships that may exist in those documents, I think seems really fascinating to me to think about that. And really the continued importance of both structured data and interoperability across systems. I think even with AI as AI in all of its different flavors, but making sure systems can talk to each other to either uncover unknown relationships that weren't there or just to help improve and enhance the work that and the materials that already exist. Tomorrow's session will explore histories and stories of the opioid crisis, explaining ways that OIDA collections serve as important resources for looking both back and forward in time. Please consider getting in contact with us if you'd like to engage further, and if you also like to engage with the incredible resource that is the archive and the excellent folks we have to make these resources discoverable, accessible, and impactful. We hope to see you at future OIDA-sponsored webinars. Symposium registrants will receive event announcements from the OIDA email list. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. Hey.